Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. They say silence is a woman's virtue in the unforgiving West. It's a sign of piety, of grace, of knowing one's place. But tonight, we tell a story about a different kind of silence. A silence that wasn't born of virtue, but forged in the fires of grief and rage. A silence that was honed and sharpened until it became the most dangerous weapon in the valley. So gather round, and listen to the story of a woman they thought was broken, and the outlaw who helped her find her voice in the roar of a gun. A tale we call, The Widow's Vow. Silence was the new language of May's world. It was a thick, suffocating thing, made of dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light, and the phantom echo of a man's heavy footfalls on the porch, a sound she would never hear again. Her small ranch house, once filled with the easy laughter of her husband, Daniel, and the scent of his pipe smoke, was now a tomb. A quiet, perfectly kept monument to a life that had been stolen in a single, brutal afternoon of violence. To the people of Harmony Creek, May was an object of pity. They saw a young widow, barely 25, her face pale and her eyes holding a haunted, distant look. They saw a fragile, broken thing, a woman who had lost her husband to the brutal ambition of Jedediah Thorne and his gang, the Black Vultures. Thorne was the serpent in their Eden, a ruthless cattle baron who was systematically squeezing the life out of the small ranchers, taking their land, their water, and their hope. Daniel, May's husband, had been the last holdout, a man whose stubborn integrity had been a rock against which Thorne's threats had broken. Until the day Thorne had decided to simply blast the rock to pieces. The official story, signed and sealed by the town's spineless, Thorne-owned sheriff, was that Daniel had been killed in a tragic cattle stampede. But everyone knew the truth. They had all seen the hoofprints of Thorne's dozen riders heading to and from the Carter Ranch that day. They had seen the clean, professional bullet holes in Daniel's chest when they'd brought the body back. They knew it was murder, a cold and calculated execution designed to be a message to them all. And the message had been received. They would bring May pies and offer hushed, fearful condolences on the street, their eyes darting nervously as if Thorne himself might be watching. They saw her silence as grief, as the natural, helpless response of a weak and defeated woman. They were wrong. Her silence was not the sound of breaking. It was the sound of hardening. Every evening, after the sun had bled out behind the western mesas, May would sit at her kitchen table and perform a ritual. She would take out Daniel's Colt Peacemaker, a gun he had rarely worn but had taught her to use with a patient, steady hand. She would meticulously clean and oil it, the metallic, rhythmic clicks of the action the only sound in the house. She would feel the cold, heavy weight of it in her hands, and she would channel the screaming, helpless agony in her soul into the cold, hard steel of the weapon. Her grief was not a passive thing, it was a forge, and in its silent, white-hot fires, her sorrow was being hammered into something new, something sharp, and cold, and deadly. She knew she could not take on Thorne and his dozen hired guns alone. They were a force of nature, a plague that had settled on the valley. The law was a joke, and her neighbors were too terrified to stand with her. She was alone, an isolated island of silent rage in a sea of fear. If she wanted justice, she could not rely on the world of honest men. She would have to seek it in the shadows. There were whispers in the valley, stories told in hushed tones around campfires and in the dark corners of the saloon. They were whispers of a man, a ghost, who lived in the high, rugged country of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. Some said he was an army deserter, others a bank robber on the run. They said he was a man with a mysterious past, a killer who had turned his back on the world. They said he was the only man in the territory who did not fear Jedediah Thorne. They called him Jack. For May, a woman who had lived her entire life in the warm, predictable light of a civilized world, the idea of seeking out a notorious outlaw was a terrifying one. It was a step into a darkness from which she might never return. But the memory of Daniel's lifeless eyes, and the sound of Thorne's men laughing as they had ridden away, was a more powerful force than fear. 1 week after Daniel's funeral, May packed a small bag with dried meat, a full canteen, and a box of .45 caliber cartridges. She saddled her horse, tucked Daniel's Colt into a holster on her hip, and as the dawn broke, she rode out. She did not ride toward the town and its false pity. She rode toward the mountains, toward the shadows, toward the last, most desperate hope a broken woman could have. She was leaving the world of the living behind to seek an alliance with a ghost. The silent widow was about to find her voice, and it would be the sound of a contract being sealed in the name of revenge. The Dragon's Tooth Mountains were a jagged and forgiving wilderness, a place where the land itself seemed hostile to human life. For 3 days, May rode deeper into the high country, following the vague, whispered directions she had gleaned in town. The journey was an ordeal, a test of the resilience and the skills her husband had taught her. She navigated the treacherous, rock-strewn trails, she hunted for her own food, and she slept with her pistol in her hand, the profound, menacing silence of the mountains her only companion. She found his lair on the 4th day. It was not a cabin, but a shallow, wind-hollowed cave, its entrance cleverly concealed by a thick stand of ancient, gnarled junipers. A thin, almost invisible plume of smoke rose from a crevice in the rocks above, the only sign that this desolate place was inhabited. She dismounted, her heart hammering against her ribs, and approached the cave on foot, her hand resting on the butt of her pistol. "That's far enough," a voice said, a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. She froze. A man stepped out from the shadows of the junipers. He was not what she had expected. He was lean and weary, not large, but he moved with a fluid, predatory grace that spoke of a deep, coiled strength. His face was a mask of hard angles and sun-scorched leather, shadowed by the brim of a battered hat. His eyes were the most startling thing about him. They were a pale, piercing gray, the color of a winter storm, and they held a stillness that was both unnerving and deeply, profoundly weary. He held a Winchester rifle in his hands, and it was pointed directly at her heart. "Who are you, and what do you want?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of curiosity. "My name is May Carter," she said, her own voice surprisingly steady. "They say your name is Jack. I've come to hire you." A flicker of something amusement, annoyance, crossed his face. "I'm not for hire," he said. "Go back to your town." "I can't," she said. "And you're the only one who can help me." She told him her story then, not with the pleading emotion of a victim, but with the simple, unadorned facts of a witness. She told him of her husband, of Jedediah Thorne, of the murder that the whole valley was pretending was an accident. Jack listened, his expression unchanging, his rifle never wavering. When she was done, he was silent for a long moment. "That's a sad story, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice as cold and as hard as the mountain granite. "But it's not my story. Thorne's business is his own. I don't get involved. They say you're the only man in this territory who isn't afraid of him," she pressed, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "I don't have much money, but my husband, he had a small stash of gold saved. It's yours. All of it. I just want one thing. I want you to help me destroy Jedediah Thorne." Jack let out a short, bitter, humorless laugh. "Lady, for what it would take to go up against Thorne and his army, your husband's little stash of gold wouldn't buy the bullets. You're wasting your time. Go home and mourn your husband like a good widow." The condescension, the dismissiveness in his voice, broke through her carefully controlled composure. "You think I'm just a weak, weeping widow, don't you?" she said, her voice rising, a flash of the fire she had been nursing for weeks now visible in her eyes. "You think I rode up here to cry on your shoulder? I didn't come here to hire a shoulder to cry on. I came here to hire a killer. Because I have a list of names, and I need a man who can help me cross them off." Her raw and varnished fury seemed to finally pierce his armor of indifference. He lowered the rifle a few inches, his gaze taking on a new, more appraising intensity. He saw not just a grieving woman, but a vessel of pure and yielding resolve. He saw a woman who had been pushed past the breaking point and had come out the other side as something hard and dangerous. "Why me?" he asked, his voice a little less harsh now. "Because," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper, "I've heard the other stories. The ones they only tell when they're drunk. I've heard about the Black Creek payroll, and the man who betrayed his partners and disappeared with the gold. I've heard about the Red Dog Gang, and how they used to run this whole territory, before their leader was ambushed and left for dead by his second-in-command, a man named Jedediah Thorne." The stillness in Jack's face was shattered. For the first time, a raw, powerful emotion flickered in his winter gray eyes, a flash of pure, murderous hatred that was a mirror of her own. She had been right. The whispers were true. This was not just a random outlaw, this was a man with a history, a man who had his own account to settle with Thorn. He was silent for a long, tense minute. The wind whispered through the pines, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "You're a clever woman, Mrs. Carter," he said finally, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Cleverer than is good for you." He lowered the rifle completely. "All right," he said. "I'll help you. Not for your gold. For reasons of my own. But you need to understand something. This path you're choosing, it's a dark one. Once you start down it, there's no turning back. You'll have to do things, become a person you never thought you could be. Are you ready for that?" May looked at him, at this dangerous, haunted man who was to be her new and likely ally. She thought of her quiet, peaceful life with Daniel, and of the cold, silent house she now inhabited. "The woman who wasn't ready for this died the day my husband was murdered," she said, her voice as cold and as steady as his. "You just tell me what I need to do." A slow, grim smile touched Jack's lips. It was not a smile of warmth, but of a shared, terrible purpose. "Good," he said. "Then your education begins tomorrow at sunrise." The alliance was sealed, not with a handshake, but with a shared look of cold, calculated fury. They were two ghosts, haunted by the same man, now bound together in an unholy quest for vengeance. They were no longer a widow and an outlaw. They were a conspiracy. May's education in the art of revenge began with a baptism by fire and gunpowder. Jack was not a gentle teacher. He was a brutal, demanding, and relentlessly pragmatic mentor who understood that in the war they were about to wage, there was no room for sentimentality or hesitation. Her first lesson was the gun. She knew how to shoot, how to hit a stationary target. Jack taught her how to kill. He set up moving targets, forced her to draw and fire under pressure, to reload with her hands shaking and her heart pounding. "You're not aiming for the bullseye, May," he would say, his voice a constant, critical growl. "You're aiming for the thing that's trying to kill you. Don't think, don't feel, just react. The man who hesitates is the man who dies." At first, the loud report of the Colt was a torment, each shot an echo of the day Daniel had died. Her hands would shake, her aim would be wild. But Jack was relentless. He pushed her past her grief, past her fear, forcing her to channel her emotions not into tears, but into a cold, focused precision. Slowly, methodically, her grief was transformed. The target was no longer a tin can or a piece of wood. It was the face of Jedediah Thorn. Her hands steadied. Her aim became true. The gun was no longer a symbol of her loss. It was becoming the instrument of her retribution. Her education extended beyond the gun. Jack taught her the silent language of the wilderness, the skills he had used to survive for years as a hunted man. He taught her how to move without a sound, how to read tracks, how to use the landscape as both a weapon and a shield. He taught her to see the world not as a home, but as a battlefield, a place of threats and opportunities. May, the rancher's wife who had once tended a garden, now learned how to set a snare, how to build a smokeless fire, how to sleep with one eye open and a knife in her hand. She was a surprisingly adept student. The quiet, observant nature that had made her a good wife now made her a keen and patient hunter. The resilience she had learned from a lifetime on the prairie made her physically and mentally tough. She was shedding the skin of her old life, and the woman emerging was leaner, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. While he trained her, Jack began to gather intelligence. He was a ghost with a network of other ghosts, disgruntled prospectors, resentful saloon girls, other men who had been wronged by Thorn. He would disappear for days at a time, returning with scraps of information about Thorn's operations. "Thorn's gotten lazy," he told her one evening, as they sat by a small, hidden campfire. "He thinks he's a king. He's built himself a fortress up at his main ranch, the Black Vulture Roost, he calls it. He's got 2 men on his payroll. But his real strength isn't the guns. It's his business. He's squeezing every last cent out of your valley, and he's using the town itself as his bank and his warehouse." The plan they began to formulate was not one of a direct, suicidal assault. It was a plan of 1,000 cuts, a strategy of attrition designed to bleed Thorn's empire dry from the inside out, using May's unique position as the harmless widow as their primary weapon. "They've forgotten about you," Jack said, his gray eyes glinting in the firelight. "They see you as a broken woman, a non-threat. We're going to use that. You're going to become our spy." The plan was terrifying, but May did not hesitate. A week later, she rode back into Harmony Creek. She was once again the grieving widow, her face pale, her shoulders slumped in a perfect imitation of defeat. She told the few people who asked that she had simply needed time away in the hills to be with her grief. No one suspected a thing. They saw what they expected to see, a woman crushed by sorrow. She began to play her part. She would visit the general store, the one Thorne now owned, and she would listen. She would sit in the church, a place Thorne used as a stage for his benevolence, and she would watch. She was a ghost in her own town, a silent, observant presence that no one paid any real attention to. At night, she would meet Jack at a prearranged spot, a secluded copse of trees down by the creek. She would pass him the information she had gathered, the schedule of Thorne's supply wagons, the names of the ranchers who were secretly working with him, the layout of the warehouse where he stored his ill-gotten goods. Based on her intelligence, Jack began to strike. He moved like a phantom, a man-insurgency. A supply wagon would be found with its axle broken and its contents spoiled. A prize bull of Thorne's would be found with a mysterious, non-fatal ailment. These were small, deniable acts, pinpricks of sabotage that could not be directly traced to anyone, but that began to cost Thorne money and create a sense of unease and incompetence among his men. As they worked together, a strange, unspoken bond formed between the widow and the outlaw. It was not a bond of affection, but of a deep, mutual respect. He saw in her a core of iron will that matched his own. She saw in him, behind the cold, hard exterior, a man who was also haunted by a past of profound betrayal. They were two broken pieces of the same violent world, and they had found in each other a shared, terrible purpose. May's transformation was nearly complete. The grief was still there, a cold, hard stone in her heart, but it was no longer her master. It was now her fuel. She was no longer just a victim. She was a conspirator, a spy, a key player in a deadly game. The widow's education was over. Her silent revenge was about to begin in earnest. The first major blow against Jedediah Thorne's empire was not struck with a gun, but with a lie, a rumor, and a carefully orchestrated piece of theater. Jack and May had learned that the lifeblood of Thorne's operation was the monthly cattle drive, where he would take a massive herd of his own cattle along with the smaller herds of the ranchers he protected to the railhead at a distant town. It was here that he laundered his power, selling the cattle and returning with the hard cash that paid his men and solidified his control. "We can't hit the drive itself," Jack had explained to May during one of their nocturnal meetings. "To many men. But a cattle drive is built on trust. Trust in the trail boss, trust in the buyers, trust in the brand. We're going to poison the trust." Their plan was intricate, a dangerous gambit that relied on May's courage and her ability to play the part of the broken widow. The first step was the rumor. Jack, using his network of underworld contacts, started a whisper in the saloons and gambling dens of the railhead town. The whisper was that the infamous Red Scourge, a highly contagious and deadly cattle disease, had been spotted in the high country near Harmony Creek. It was a lie, but a plausible one, the kind of rumor that could make a cattle buyer very, very nervous. The second step was the proof. May, playing the part of a desperate widow trying to make ends meet, began selling off some of her husband's old tools in town. In her conversations with the blacksmith and the general store ownerman, she knew to be gossips, if not allies of Thornish, would let slip her fears. "I worry so for my small herd," she would say, her voice trembling with a perfectly feigned anxiety. "Old man Hemlock, up on the North Ridge, he lost 2 cows last week. Said they just laid down and died, a terrible bloody froth on their mouths." It was a lie, but a lie that would be repeated, embellished, and would eventually find its way to the ears of the men who mattered. The final and most dangerous step was May's own. The day before the big cattle drive was set to begin, she rode out to a remote, lined shack on the edge of Thorne's vast property. It was a place used by Thorne's men as an overnight shelter during roundups. She knew from her intelligence gathering that 2 of Thorne's most trusted trail hands would be staying there that night. She did not go to kill them. She went to plant the final piece of evidence. She waited until they were asleep. She slipped into the small, dark cabin like a ghost. She carried with her a small pouch containing a foul-smelling mixture of herbs and animal blood that Jack had prepared. She sprinkled this mixture on the bedrolls of the two sleeping men and on the sacks of feed for their horses. She also left a single, carefully placed item on the table, a small, empty medicine bottle, with a faded, handwritten label that read, in crude lettering, "Cattle Scourge Tincture, for veterinary use only." She was gone before the men even stirred. The next morning, as the cattle drive was being assembled, a local rancheroni of the few who had secretly allied with May and Elias rode into Thorne's camp in a state of feigned panic. "Thorne," he yelled, "my herd. They're sick, dying on their feet. It's the Red Scourge." Thorne, at first, was dismissive, but then the two trail hands who had slept in the line shack rode in, their faces pale. "Boss," one of them said, "our horses. They're sick. And we don't feel so good ourselves." The seed of panic was sown. Thorne, who was a bully but not a fool, knew that even the rumor of the Red Scourge could be financially ruinous. A sick herd was worthless. He ordered his own veterinarian, a man who was more of a horse doctor and a drunk, to inspect the panicked rancher's cattle. The vet, who had been paid handsomely by Jack the night before, made a great show of examining the cattle, which were perfectly healthy. He then found the evidence May had planted back at the line shack. He brought the empty medicine bottle to Thorne, his face a mask of grave concern. "It's true," he declared, his voice loud enough for all the assembled ranchers to hear. "Someone's been trying to poison the herd, trying to cover it up with this fake medicine. This whole drive is at risk." The chaos was immediate. The other ranchers, their life's work at stake, refused to let their herds join Thorne's. They would not risk having their healthy cattle infected. The cattle drive, the financial engine of Thorne's empire, fell apart before it even began. Thorne was apoplectic. He was faced with a financial catastrophe. He had 24 armed men on his payroll with no cash to pay them. He was trapped in his own valley with a massive herd of cattle that no one would buy. But the most damaging blow was to his authority. He had promised his client ranchers protection and prosperity. Instead, he had delivered disaster. They saw him not as a powerful leader, but as an incompetent buffoon whose own men were either too stupid or too corrupt to prevent such a catastrophe. His image as an untouchable titan was beginning to crack. That evening, May and Jack met at their usual spot by the creek. The valley below was quiet, the massive cattle herd still milling aimlessly in Thorne's pastures. "It worked," May said, a note of disbelieving triumph in her voice. "It's just the first cut," Jack replied, his face grim in the moonlight. "We've wounded him. A wounded animal is a dangerous one. He's going to be looking for someone to blame. And he's going to be looking for blood." He was right. They had won a major victory without firing a single shot. They had used Thorne's own greed and the fear of his clients against him. But in doing so, they had pushed a ruthless man into a corner. The silent war was about to get very loud and very bloody. May, the quiet widow, had helped to cripple a king. Now, she would have to face his wrath. Jedediah Thorne was not a man who handled humiliation well. The catastrophic failure of the cattle drive was more than a financial blow. It was a deep, personal wound to his monstrous ego. He had been outmaneuvered, made to look like a fool in front of the very people he had worked so hard to dominate. His kingdom, built on the illusion of absolute control, had been shaken to its foundations, not by a rival army, but by a whisper, a rumor, a phantom disease. In the dark, paranoid chambers of his heart, he did not see this as a clever act of sabotage. He saw it as witchcraft, a personal attack orchestrated by an enemy he could not see. And his response was not one of cold, calculated strategy. It was a blind, lashing out fury. He needed a scapegoat, a visible, tangible target upon which to vent his rage and reassert his terrifying authority. And his gaze, fueled by a festering, misogynistic resentment, fell upon the one person in the valley who had become a symbol of quiet, stubborn defiance, the widow, May Carter. He had no proof. He had no reason to suspect her other than the simple, arrogant fact that she was the widow of the man he had murdered, a loose thread he had never properly tied off. In his rage-addled mind, her quiet grief was a mask for a simmering rebellion. She was the witch who had conjured this plague upon him, and she would burn for it. The retribution came 2 nights after the failed cattle drive. It was not a subtle act. It was a brutal, public declaration of power. Thorne and a half-dozen of his most loyal, and most brutal, men rode to the Carter homestead under the cover of a moonless night. They were not a posse, they were a lynch mob. May was not entirely unprepared. Jack had warned her that Thorne would retaliate, that she would be a likely target. They had arranged a signal, a way for her to warn him if she was in trouble. But she had not expected the attack to be so swift, so direct. She was awakened by the sound of splintering wood as her front door was kicked in. She had just enough time to grab Daniel's Colt from the nightstand and scramble into the small, hidden root cellar beneath her kitchen floor before the house was filled with the sound of heavy, booted footsteps and the coarse laughter of cruel men. Find her, she heard Thorne's voice roar, a sound of pure, unrestrained fury. Tear this place apart if you have to. She huddled in the darkness of the cellar, her heart hammering against her ribs, the pistol clutched in her trembling hands. She could hear them above her, destroying her home, smashing the furniture her husband had built, tearing apart the life she had tried so desperately to hold together. She knew she could not fight them. She was one woman against a gang of killers. Her only hope was to remain hidden, to wait them out. But then she heard the one sound that turned her blood to ice. "Boss," one of the men yelled from outside. "We found something in the barn. The signal lamp. It's still warm." Her blood ran cold. The signal. In her haste, she had prepared the signal lamp, a red-tinted lantern she was to place in the barn window to warn Jack that she had been discovered before she could light it. Now, they had found it. They knew she was not just a helpless widow. She was part of a conspiracy. So, she heard Thorne's voice, now dangerously close to the cellar door above her. "The little mouse has claws. And she has friends in the mountains." A heavy object was dragged across the floor, scraping directly over her head. It was the heavy oak kitchen table. They were blocking her only exit. "Well," Thorne continued, his voice taking on a tone of chilling, sadistic pleasure, "if she likes the dark so much, let's give her some light to go with it. Burn it." The word was a death sentence. She heard them splashing coal oil on the floorboards above her head. She smelled the acrid, telltale scent. She was going to be burned alive, trapped in this small, dark hole, just as her husband had been left to die in an open field. Panic, pure and absolute, seized her. She screamed, a raw, terrified sound, and pounded on the heavy wooden door above her. "No, please, let me out." Her screams were met only by Thorne's cold, mocking laughter. "You can tell my regards to your husband, Mrs. Carter," he yelled. "Tell him Jedediah Thorne always finishes the job." She heard the whoosh of the flames taking hold, the hungry, crackling roar as the fire began to consume her home. The air in the cellar grew thick and hot, smoke beginning to snake through the cracks in the floorboards above. She was going to die. But in that moment of ultimate terror, something inside her snapped. The fear was burned away, replaced by a pure, primal instinct to survive. She would not die like this. She would not give him the satisfaction. She remembered the old stories her grandfather had told her, of how the first settlers had built these root cellars with a secondary, escape tunnel, a small, narrow passage that led out to the nearby creek bed, in case of fire or Indian attack. Frantically, she began to feel along the dirt walls of the cellar, her hands scrabbling in the darkness. She found it. A section of the wall that felt different, looser. She clawed at the dirt and the loose fieldstones with her bare hands, her nails tearing, her fingers raw and bleeding. The smoke was getting thicker, her lungs burning, the roar of the fire above her a deafening, hellish symphony. With a final, desperate heave, she pulled the last stone free, revealing a small, dark opening, barely large enough for her to crawl through. Without a moment's hesitation, she plunged into the narrow, suffocating blackness of the tunnel, pulling herself forward on her elbows, the sound of her home being destroyed echoing behind her. She emerged, choking and gasping, into the cool night air of the creek bed, 100 yards from the inferno that had once been her house. She lay there for a moment, her body trembling, her lungs aching, and she watched as the roof of her home collapsed in a shower of sparks and embers, a final, fiery punctuation mark on the end of her old life. She had lost everything. Her husband, her home, the last vestiges of the woman she had once been. All she had left was the clothes on her back, the pistol in her hand, and a hatred so pure and so cold it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing into a heap of ash herself. She looked up at the distant, dark shapes of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. Jack. He would be waiting for her signal. When it didn't come, he would know something was wrong. But he would not know the extent of Thorne's brutality. May Carter, the quiet widow, stood up. She was no longer a conspirator. She was no longer a spy. She was a woman who had been buried alive and had clawed her way out of her own grave. And she was done with clever plans and subtle acts of sabotage. The time for whispers was over. The time for screams, and gunfire, and blood was about to begin. She turned her face toward the mountains and began to walk, a ghost leaving a trail of smoke and ruin, on her way to collect her one, and only ally for the final, bloody act of her war. Jack saw the glow of the fire from his high mountain perch. It was a malevolent, orange stain against the black, star-dusted canvas of the night sky, in the precise direction of the Carter homestead. He had been waiting for May's signal, a single, brief flash of a red lantern. He had not expected a bonfire. A cold, familiar dread, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in years, settled in his gut. He had known this was a risk. He had known Thorne was a cornered, rabid animal. But he had underestimated the depths of the man's sadistic cruelty. He had used May, had put her in the line of fire, and now, he feared, his gamble had cost her her life. He moved through the night with a speed and a purpose he hadn't felt since the days he had ridden with the Red Dog Gang. He was no longer a cautious, patient ghost. He was a predator, closing in on a scent of blood that he feared was the blood of his only ally. He reached the smoldering, blackened ruins of the Carter Ranch just before dawn. The scene was one of utter, vindictive devastation. The house was a skeletal, smoking ruin. The barn had been burned to the ground. Even the fences had been torn down, the few remaining cattle scattered to the winds. He searched the ruins, his face a grim, stony mask, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He was looking for a body. He found no sign of her. For a moment, a flicker of hope ignited in the cold darkness of his soul. But it was quickly extinguished. Thorne wouldn't have just killed her. He would have taken her. A man like Thorne would want a prize, a trophy to display, to break, further humiliate his enemies. As the first, gray, pre-dawn light began to filter through the smoke-filled air, a sudden, torrential rain began to fall. It was a cold, miserable downpour that turned the ash and dust into a thick, greasy mud. It was as if the heavens themselves were weeping for the desecration of this place. But for Jack, the rain was a gift. He was a tracker, and the rain, while it would wash away old tracks, would make new ones stand out in sharp relief. He began to circle the ruins, his storm gray eyes scanning the muddy ground. He found them, the tracks of a dozen shod horses. Thorne's men. They had ridden out, heading not back toward the main ranch, but east, toward a place called Hangman's Crossing. And then he found another set of tracks, smaller, the tracks of a single person, on foot, heading not east, but north, toward the mountains. Toward him, May. He followed her trail, his heart a confusing mixture of profound relief and a new, unfamiliar emotion that felt dangerously like concern. He found her a mile from the ranch, huddled under a rocky outcropping, soaked to the bone, shivering, her face smudged with soot, her eyes holding the haunted, thousand-yard stare of a soldier who has seen too much combat. She looked up as he approached, and the first thing he saw was not fear or grief. It was a cold, hard, and utterly terrifying emptiness. The gentle, grieving woman he had met weeks ago was gone, burned away in the fires of her home. The woman who remained was something new, something forged in the crucible of absolute loss. "He was going to burn me alive," she said, her voice a low, flat, toneless thing. I heard him laughing. Jack did not offer words of comfort. They would have been useless, insulting. He simply took off his own heavy, oilskin duster and wrapped it around her shivering shoulders. It was an act of simple, practical kindness, but it was also the most profound gesture of compassion he had shown to another human being in a decade. "They're heading for Hangman's Crossing," he said, his voice a low growl. "He has a line shack out there he uses for wrestling. He's probably taken some of the ranchers who defied him. He's going to make a public example of them. He's going to hang them," she whispered, her eyes wide with a new horror. "Yes," Jack said. They stood there in the pouring rain, two ghosts in a world of gray, the smoldering ruins of May's life behind them, and the prospect of a new slaughter ahead. "I'm going after them," Jack said, his voice final. "This ends now. You should find a safe place. Wait for me." May looked at him, and for the first time since he had found her, an emotion flickered in her dead eyes. It was not fear. It was a pure, unadulterated fury. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a new, hard authority that he had never heard before. "You are not going without me. This is my fight. This is my vow. I was there when he killed my husband. I will be there when he dies." She pushed herself to her feet, her small frame seeming to possess a new, unshakable strength. She pulled Daniel's Colt from the pocket of her dress, the gun a dark, menacing presence in the gray light. "You taught me how to use this. Now, you're going to let me use it." Jack looked at her, at the woman who had clawed her way out of her own grave, and he saw not a liability, but an ally, an equal. He saw a soul that had been forged in the same fires of betrayal and loss as his own. He gave a single, grim nod. "All right," he said, "but we do this my way. They'll be expecting a direct assault on the shack. We're not going to give it to them. We're going to use the storm. We're going to use the night. And we're going to use their own arrogance against them." They rode out together, two avenging spirits on a single horse, the driving rain washing the soot from their faces, but not the cold, murderous purpose from their hearts. They were no longer a widow and an outlaw. They were a reckoning, and they were riding into the heart of a storm, both real and metaphorical, to deliver a final, bloody piece of justice to Jedediah Thorne and his black vultures. The silent widow and her outlaw were about to give Thorne a lesson in the true meaning of fear. Hangman's Crossing was a place steeped in a grim and bloody history. It was a narrow, muddy ford on the Serenity River, marked by a single massive and ancient cottonwood tree whose thickest branch grew out over the water, a near-perfect, natural gallows. It was here that vigilante justice had been dispensed in the valley's early, lawless days, and the place had retained an aura of death and finality. Jedediah Thorne, a man with a flair for cruel symbolism, had chosen this spot for his theater of terror. The line shack was a small, crude cabin set back 100 yards from the riverbank, and it had been turned into a temporary prison. Inside, 3 of the ranchers who had dared to stand with May were being held, their faces bruised and bloody, their spirits broken. Thorne and his remaining dozen men were in the shack with them, drinking whiskey, their mood a celebratory, sadistic mix as they waited for the rain to let up so they could begin the hangings. They were confident, arrogant, and utterly oblivious to the 2 figures who were, at that very moment, moving like shadows through the storm-lashed woods that surrounded the clearing. Jack and May approached the camp from downwind, the driving rain and the roar of the swollen river masking their scent and their sound. They moved with a slow, coordinated grace, to predators closing in on their prey. Jack, with a lifetime of experience in such matters, had formulated a plan that was both brutally simple and elegantly cruel. It was not a plan for a shootout. It was a plan for a silent, terrifying, and systematic dismantling. "They're drunk and they're comfortable," he whispered to May as they lay on a rain-soaked ridge overlooking the shack, the dim, yellow light from its single window a beacon in the gloom. "They're not expecting an attack. Not in this storm. Their arrogance is their weakness. We will not attack the cabin directly. We will pick off the sentries, and then we will turn their fortress into their tomb." Their first targets were the 2 guards posted outside. They were huddled under a makeshift lean-to, trying to stay out of the worst of the rain, their rifles propped against the wall. Jack gestured to May, pointing to the guard on the left. "He's yours." It was the ultimate test of her transformation. This was not a target. This was a man. May's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she raised Daniel's Colt. She remembered Jack's lessons: don't think, don't feel, just react. She took a slow, steadying breath, aimed for the center of the man's chest, and squeezed the trigger. Her shot was almost lost in a sudden, deafening clap of thunder. The guard grunted and collapsed without a sound. At the exact same instant, a throwing knife, thrown with a blinding, expert speed from Jack's hand, embedded itself in the throat of the second guard. The 2 sentries were dead before they even knew they were under attack. The 2 avengers slipped from the ridge and made their way to the cabin, their movements silent as the falling rain. They did not try the door. Jack led May to the rear of the cabin, where a single, small, glassless window looked out into the darkness. He peered inside. He could see Thorne and his men, gathered around a table, their backs to the window, their attention focused on a bottle of whiskey and their 3 terrified prisoners. Jack pulled a length of thin, strong wire from his pocket. "The horses," he whispered to May. "Go. Now." While May slipped away toward the tethered horses, Jack went to work. With a patient, terrifying skill, he began to thread the wire back and forth across the window opening, weaving a crude, nearly invisible web. He then took a small, heavy axe from his belt. May reached the horses. With a few quick, silent cuts of her knife, she severed their reins, then gave the lead horse a sharp, stinging slap on the rump. The horses, spooked and now untethered, bolted, a chaotic, thundering stampede that crashed through the sodden woods. Inside the cabin, the sound of the stampeding horses finally penetrated the drunken haze. "What the hell was that?" one of the men yelled. Two of them, mugs still in hand, stumbled to the front door and peered out into the rain-swept darkness. And it was in that moment that Jack acted. With a single, powerful swing of his axe, he brought the heavy blade down on the thick hemp rope that served as the cabin's main structural support. A single massive beam that ran the length of the roof. The axe bit deep. He swung again, and then again. The rope weakened, frayed, and then, with a groaning, tearing sound, it snapped. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The heavy, waterlogged sod roof, its main support gone, collapsed inward with a deafening roar, a crushing avalanche of mud, timber, and rain. The men at the front door were crushed instantly. The lamp inside was smashed, plunging the interior into a suffocating, terrifying darkness. The men who were not killed in the initial collapse were now trapped, wounded and disoriented, in a dark, muddy tomb, the weight of the roof pinning them. The screams of the wounded and the dying their only company. Jack did not wait. He ran to the front of the cabin, where May was already waiting. He handed her a second pistol. "No survivors," he said, his voice as cold and as hard as the grave. "They showed your husband no mercy. We will show them none." What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Jack and May moved through the ruins of the cabin, their pistols roaring in the darkness. They were not killing men. They were putting down rabid animals, ending the threat with a cold, brutal efficiency. They found the 3 captured ranchers, miraculously alive, shielded from the worst of the collapse by the heavy oak table they had been huddled under. They cut them free and sent them running into the rainy darkness, their minds reeling from the sudden, violent salvation. And then, they found Thorne. He was alive, his leg pinned beneath a heavy beam, his face a mask of terror and disbelief in the flickering, dying light of the hearth fire. He looked up and saw the 2 figures standing over him, the silent, grieving widow and the outlaw ghost she had brought with her from the mountains. "Please," he whimpered, the last vestiges of his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a pathetic, terrified man. "Mercy." May stepped forward, Daniel's Colt held steady in her hand. She looked down at the man who had destroyed her life, the man who had laughed as her home had burned. The face of her husband, his kind, gentle smile, flashed in her mind. Then she saw his body, the 2 clean bullet holes in his chest. The silence that had defined her for so long was finally broken. "Did you show him mercy?" she asked, and her voice was not the voice of a grieving widow. It was the voice of a judge, a jury, and an executioner, and it was the last thing Jedediah Thorne would ever hear. She looked at the heavy beam that was pinning him. She raised her pistol, but she did not aim it at Thorne's head. She aimed it at the splintered piece of wood that was his only support. The shot echoed in the ruins, and the beam shifted, its full weight settling with a sickening, final crunch. She then turned, without a backward glance, and walked out of the ruins of the cabin, back into the cleansing rain, leaving the man who had murdered her husband to be buried alive in his own dark and muddy tomb. The devil's rope had done its work. The vultures were dead. The vow had been kept. The rain stopped just before sunrise, leaving the world washed clean, the air crisp and cold. The first light of dawn revealed a scene of stark, brutal finality at Hangman's Crossing. The collapsed cabin was a muddy, timber-strewn grave, a silent testament to the terrible justice that had been dispensed in the night. The river, swollen and brown, rushed past, carrying the last vestiges of the storm out of the valley. May and Jack stood on the riverbank, 2 solitary figures in the quiet, gray light. They were soaked to the bone, their faces smudged with gunpowder, their bodies aching with a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. The fire of their shared vengeance, which had burned so hot and so fiercely, had been extinguished, leaving a cold, hollow emptiness in its wake. The war was over. The vultures were dead. And in the silence that followed, a new and spoken question hung in the air between them. What now? They were two ghosts from different worlds, brought together by a shared enemy. Now that the enemy was gone, the fragile, violent alliance that had bound them together seemed to have no purpose. It was May who broke the silence. "Is it done?" she asked, her voice a quiet, wondering thing. It felt unreal. The all-consuming purpose that had driven her for weeks, that had reshaped her from a grieving wife into a hardened killer, was gone. "He's dead," Jack replied, his voice a low rumble. "They're all dead. It's done." He looked at her, at the woman who had stood beside him in the heart of the storm, who had faced down her demons and had pulled the trigger without flinching. He saw not the fragile widow he had first met, but a woman of terrifying, tempered steel. He felt a strange, unfamiliar pang of respect, and something else, something he dared not put a name to. "What will you do now?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the rushing water. "What I always do," he said, his voice flat. "Disappear. There will be questions. The law will come. Men like me, we're not meant for the aftermath." He looked up at the mountains, his natural home, the wilderness that had always been his only true sanctuary. "And me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She was a murderer. She had taken part in a slaughter. The quiet, respectable life she had once known was a country to which she could never return. She was as much of an outlaw now as he was. "Where do I go?" Jack was silent for a long moment. He was a man who had spent his life cutting ties, a solitary creature who understood that attachments were a liability, a weakness that could get a man killed. The smart thing to do, the safe thing, was to turn and walk away, to melt back into the mountains and leave her to her own fate. He had fulfilled his part of their dark bargain. His debt to the past, his score with Thorn, was settled. He owed her nothing more. But as he looked at her, at this woman who had walked through the fires of hell and had emerged, scarred but unbroken, he found that he could not do it. He could not leave her alone in the ruins of the world they had just created. His betrayal at the hands of Thorn had taught him the bitter price of being abandoned. He would not inflict that same fate on her. "We go," he said, the words sounding strange and unfamiliar on his tongue. He had not said we in a very long time. "There are other places. Places to the west. Oregon, maybe. Places where a man and a woman can start over, where the past can't find them." It was not a declaration of love. It was not a promise of a happy ending. It was a simple, pragmatic statement of fact. A recognition that they were now two sides of the same tarnished coin, two outcasts who were now bound together not by vengeance, but by the shared, terrible knowledge of what they had done. May looked at him, and for the first time, she saw beyond the cold-eyed outlaw. She saw a man as lost and as haunted as she was, a man who was offering not a solution, but a shared exile. It was not the future she had ever dreamed of, but it was a future, and it was infinitely better than a future spent alone. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Their first act as partners in this new and certain life was to go back for the 3 ranchers they had freed. They found them huddled in a nearby cave, terrified and half frozen, but alive. "It's over," May told them, her voice gentle, the voice of the woman she had once been. "Thorn is dead. You're free." They helped the men back to the edge of the valley, to a place where they could find their way home. "What will you tell them?" Jack asked the oldest of the ranchers. The man looked at Jack, then at May, his eyes filled with a deep, knowing gratitude. "We will tell them," he said, his voice firm, "that Jedediah Thorn and his men were killed in the storm, that the river rose and their cabin was washed away. We will say it was an act of God." He looked at May, a silent understanding passing between them. "And in a way," he added softly, "I suppose it was. The valley would have its story, a story that would allow it to heal, to bury the past and begin again." As the ranchers made their way back to their homes, May and Jack stood at the edge of the woods, looking out at the valley that had been her home. The sun was fully up now, its light glinting off the rain-washed leaves, making the world look clean and new. It was a beautiful place, but it was no longer her place. "Are you ready?" Jack asked. May took one last look at the rolling hills, at the distant, familiar shapes of the homesteads. She thought of Daniel, buried in the small churchyard. She had avenged him. His spirit, she hoped, could finally rest. She turned her back on the valley, on the woman she had been, and on the life she had lost. "I'm ready," she said. They mounted their horses and, without a backward glance, they rode west, to solitary figures disappearing into the vast, and forgiving, and unknown landscape. They were no longer a widow and an outlaw. They were survivors, partners in a new and uncertain future, to ghosts riding away from the silence of the dawn, toward whatever came next. The journey west was a long, silent pilgrimage. May and Jack rode for weeks, putting 1,000 miles of harsh and forgiving country between themselves and the ghosts of Harmony Creek. They moved through the raw, ever-changing landscape of the West, a world of vast, empty plains, treacherous mountain passes, and brawling, transient towns that seemed to spring up overnight and disappear just as quickly. They were to solitary figures, bound by a shared and spoken history of violence. The easy camaraderie of their quest for vengeance was gone, replaced by a tense and certain quiet. In the mountains, with a clear enemy and a shared purpose, they had been a seamless, efficient team. Now, in the aftermath, they were just a man and a woman. To strangers who knew each other's darkest secrets but were only just beginning to learn about the people they were beneath the armor of their grief and rage. Jack was a man adrift. For years, his life had been defined by two things: survival and his long-simmering hatred for Jedediah Thorne. Now that Thorne was dead, a vast, empty space had opened up in his soul. He had no purpose, no destination. He was a creature of the wilderness and the shadows, and he found himself ill at ease in the settled, civilized world they were moving toward. He was gruff, impatient, and prone to long, brooding silences. May, for her part, was struggling to come to terms with the woman she had become. The cold, hard shell she had built around herself during her quest for revenge was beginning to crack, and the grief she had suppressed for so long began to seep through the fissures. She would be struck by sudden, unexpected waves of sorrow, the memory of Daniel's laughter, or the feel of his hand in hers ambushing her in the middle of a quiet afternoon. She had been a killer, a warrior. Now, she had to learn how to be a person again, and she did not know if that was even possible. Their fragile alliance was tested a dozen times a day. They argued over which trail to take, over how to spend their dwindling funds, over the simple, mundane things that to people forced into constant proximity will always argue about. But they never left each other. There was an invisible, unbreakable thread that held them together, the shared knowledge that they were the only two people in the world who truly understood what the other had been through. They were each other's only witness. They finally reached the Oregon Territory, a land of towering green trees, misty rain, and a rich, dark soil that promised a new beginning. They found a small, secluded valley, not unlike Harmony Creek, but wilder, less tamed. Using the last of the money they had, they bought a small, abandoned homestead, a place to finally stop running. The work of building a new life was hard, but it was honest. They repaired the cabin, cleared the fields, and began the slow, arduous process of trying to carve a life out of the wilderness. The shared, physical labor became their new language, a way to communicate without the need for difficult, painful words. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown, and in the shared exhaustion at the end of the day, they found a kind of peace. But the ghosts of their past were not so easily banished. Jack would still wake in the middle of the night, his hand reaching for a gun that was no longer there, the echoes of old gunfights ringing in his ears. May would sometimes stand in the middle of a field, paralyzed by a sudden, vivid memory, the scent of wood smoke on the wind bringing her back to the night her home had burned. They were two deeply wounded people, trying to build a home on a foundation of broken pieces. The intimacy of their shared life was both a comfort and a source of constant, low-grade tension. They slept in the same small cabin, but they were as distant as two stars in the night sky. The turning point came one evening in late fall. A cold, early snow had blanketed the valley, trapping them in the cabin. The silence between them had become heavy, unbearable. "I can't do this anymore, Jack," May said finally, her voice a low, trembling thing. She was staring into the fire, her face pale in the flickering light. "I can't keep pretending that we're just two ordinary people, that the past didn't happen." Jack, who had been cleaning a rifle, stopped, his hands going still. "The past is done," he said, his voice a low growl. "No, it's not," she said, turning to face him, her eyes shining with tears. It's in this room with us. It's in every silence, every look. I see him, Jack. I see Thorne's face every time I close my eyes. And I see my husband's. And then, I see the faces of the men I killed. Her voice broke on a sob. I don't know who I am anymore. Jack stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the white, silent world. You're a survivor, May, he said, his back to her. Is that all I am? She cried. Is that all we are? To survivors, hiding at the edge of the world, haunted by the people we used to be and the things we've done. He was silent for a long time. I was a monster long before I met you, he said finally, his voice a raw, painful whisper. Thorne. He didn't just betray me. He made me. He took a young, stupid kid and he taught him how to be a killer, a thief. He taught me that trust is for fools and that mercy is a weakness. When he left me for dead, he didn't just leave a partner. He left his own creation. He turned from the window, and in his eyes, she saw a depth of pain and self-loathing that mirrored her own. When I met you, you were the first decent thing I had touched in 20 years. And I dragged you down into the mud with me. No, she said, her voice soft now. You didn't drag me down. You taught me how to fight. You helped me find a justice I never would have found on my own. She stood up and walked to him, until she was standing just a foot away. We are not just the things we've done, Jack, she said, her voice pleading. We can't be. There has to be something more. There has to be a way to build a life that's not just about surviving. A life that's about living. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his cheek. It was the first time she had willingly touched him since their quest had ended. His skin was rough, scarred, but beneath it, she felt not the coldness of a killer, but the simple, human warmth of a man. He flinched at her touch, as if burned, a lifetime of defensive walls rising up. But he did not pull away. He simply stood there, his stormy gray eyes locked on hers, a silent, desperate battle raging within him. I don't know how, he whispered, his voice full of a vulnerability she had never heard before. I don't know how to be anything else. Then we'll learn, she said softly. Together. It was a bargain. A new kind of alliance. A ghost's bargain, made not for vengeance, but for a far more difficult and elusive prize, redemption. It was a promise to try a first, tentative step out of the long, dark shadows of their past, toward the uncertain, but shared, light of a possible future. The snow fell outside, blanketing the world in a pristine, white silence, and for the first time, the silence in the small cabin did not feel like an absence. It felt like a beginning. The years that followed were a testament to the quiet, stubborn resilience of the human heart. The life May and Jack built in their secluded Oregon Valley was not an easy one, nor was it a life entirely free of ghosts. But it was a life. A real, tangible, and hard-won thing. They did not become the idyllic, smiling homesteaders of a storybook. They remained a quiet, solitary people, marked forever by the scars of their past. Their home was not filled with boisterous laughter, but with a deep, comfortable silence, a shared understanding that needed no words. They were two solitary wolves who had, against all odds, learned to run as a pack. The nightmares did not disappear entirely, but they came less frequently. The ghosts of the men they had killed, and the loved ones they had lost, still visited in the dark hours of the night, but their power to torment was lessened by the simple, grounding presence of another soul in the darkness. They never spoke of love. The word was too small, too simple for the complex, deeply intertwined thing that had grown between them. It was a bond forged in the crucible of shared violence, tempered by a mutual and spoken vow to stand as guardians of each other's broken pieces. It was a love that was less a passionate fire and more a slow, steady, and life-giving warmth, like the embers of a hearth that never quite go out. They became a quiet, respected, if somewhat mysterious, part of the small community that grew up in the valley around them. They were known as the Carters, May having reclaimed her husband's name, and Jack, a man with no name of his own, having simply, and quietly, adopted it. They were known for their fierce independence, their incredible work ethic, and their quiet, almost intimidating integrity. They were good neighbors, always willing to lend a hand, but they kept their distance, their past a closed book that they never opened for anyone. The final test of their new life, the final echo of their violent past, came a decade after they had settled. A slick, well-dressed land agent, representing a powerful railroad company from the east, came to the valley. He used the same familiar tactics of intimidation and legal maneuvering that Jedediah Thorne had once employed, trying to force the small homesteaders to sell their land for a fraction of its worth. The community, frightened and disorganized, was on the verge of capitulating. But May and Jack, who had seen this serpent before, refused to bow. They did not take up their guns. They had buried them, both literally and figuratively, years ago. Instead, they used the lessons of their past to fight a different kind of war. May, who had once been a spy in her own town, now became a community organizer. She went from farm to farm, her voice quiet but firm, her presence a source of unshakable strength. She reminded them of their shared stake in the land, of the power they had when they stood together. Jack, the man who had once been a master of sabotage and violence, now became a brilliant, behind-the-scenes strategist. He used his knowledge of the law's dark underbelly to find loopholes in the railroad's contracts. He used his old network of contacts to dig up damning information on the land agent's corrupt past. Together, they rallied the valley. They fought the railroad not with bullets, but with petitions, with legal challenges, and with a stubborn, united refusal to be broken. And they won. The railroad, faced with a costly and protracted legal battle against a community that would not be intimidated, finally backed down and rerouted their line. On the evening after their victory was announced, May and Jack stood on the porch of the home they had built together, looking out at the peaceful valley they had, once again, fought to protect. "We did it," May said, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "Without a single shot being fired." Jack put his arm around her shoulders, a simple, natural gesture that spoke of a decade of shared life and unspoken affection. "Different kind of war," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Different kind of weapons." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a perfect, comfortable fit. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The old life, the freedom of it." Jack was silent for a long time, looking out at the setting sun as it painted the clouds in hues of orange and gold. "I miss the man I was before all that," he said, his voice raw with a rare and guarded honesty. "But the man I became, him, I was happy to leave in the dust." He looked down at her, and in his storm-gray eyes, she saw not the haunted outlaw, but the man he was now, a husband, a farmer, a protector. "Everything I need is right here." It was the closest he would ever come to saying "I love you," and it was more than enough. The story of the widow and the outlaw did not end with a blaze of glory or a final, bloody confrontation. It ended, as all the best Western stories do, with a quiet sunset. It ended with two broken people who had found in each other not a solution to their pain, but a way to carry it together. They had discovered that the greatest strength is not in the hand that holds the gun, but in the hand that reaches out to another in the darkness. The vow of vengeance had been fulfilled, but it had been replaced by a new and spoken vow, a promise to build a life, to nurture a garden, to stand together against the shadows, and to find, in the quiet, simple peace of their shared exile, a final and lasting form of redemption.